on the current situation from different angles and from different perspectives. So our first speaker, and the idea is that I asked our participants of the roundtable to speak up to 10 minutes, and then after that we'll have floor open for questions and comments and discussion in general. And also each of the speakers will discuss the topic in general, but also will have a particular focus. And Mary Serrotti, who is distinguished professor of historical studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, will be the first to speak, and she'll talk about the American-Ukrainian relations up to the current developments starting from 1989 and 1991. She'll be followed by our own George Soroka, who is from the government department here across the street. I'm not sure where the street is that way.
I traveled a long distance.
Okay, it's that way. And George agreed to talk again with special focus on the American politics. Emily Channel Justice, who is the director of the Temerty program and is the key organizer of this event, will discuss Ukraine. And Margarita Balmaceda, who is professor of international relations and diplomacy at Seton Hall University, will conclude this discussion, but also with a special focus on the oil and gas and whether those issues are in any way related to the impeachment and to the current controversy. So without further ado, I'm passing the mic. Actually, the mic is there, or we don't have mic. We speak without it. So metaphorical mic to Mary Serrotti. Mary, please.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming, especially on short notice. Serhii just asked me to do this over the weekend, so I'm impressed with the level of interest. When Serhii asked me to do this, I said, Serhii, I cannot speak at a Ukrainian event. I have never been to Ukraine. I do not speak Ukrainian. I am not qualified to be here. And Serhii said, sadly, that applies to many so-called Ukraine experts. The only difference is I'm going to admit it. So I am slightly surprised to find myself here. What I am an expert in, and this is as a result of a new book which I am currently writing, is the importance of Ukraine to the United States. That I am more than qualified to talk about because I've spent the last about 3.5 years getting documents declassified from the Clinton Library. And I have had, in particular in the course of the past year, a great deal of success. I've gotten not only nearly all Clinton-Yeltsin conversations declassified, but also Clinton-Kravchuk, Clinton-Kuchma, and a bunch of other documents as well related to U.S.-Ukrainian relations. The reason I've done this is that I've been writing a book about NATO expansion. And it turns out, and this was a great surprise to me, it turns out that Ukrainian politics plays a crucial role in the history of NATO expansion. And so I've been besieging Serhii with emails and requests for names and for contacts and trying to learn as much as possible as I can about Ukrainian politics because it is so central to my story about NATO expansion. And now because of what's happening today in the White House, it's becoming even more central to U.S. politics today. So I'd like to just I have a few remarks I'd like to make, and then I also have brought with pulled up here the MemCon, the Trump-Zelensky MemCon. This is the kind of thing I get declassified all the time. I've gotten thousands and thousands of these declassified. What's a little unusual about this one is the date on it, July 25th, 2019. That's a lot more recent than the documents I usually get declassified. Another thing that's unusual about it is it was declassified by the president personally. The president has declassification authority, so he can declassify whatever he wants, otherwise we would never have seen this. So if we want in the question and discussion session to go through this and talk about what it is, this isn't quite a transcript, it's close, but it's meant to give deniability. If you're interested in the details of what this document is, that I am expert on, and I'd be happy to talk about that in the question and answer session. But let me just make a few just general remarks and then hand it over to the real Ukraine experts. So, for roughly the past quarter century, nearly all major efforts at establishing a durable post-Cold War order on the Eurasian continent have foundered on the shoals of Ukrainian politics. And now the U.S. presidency hangs in the balance as well. How did this happen? Well, to understand how we got here, there's 4 historical moments you need to understand, and then we'll hand it over to people who are going to talk about more contemporary issues. The first moment arises in the chaos surrounding the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990 and 1991. The last Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, and the first Russian president, Boris Yeltsin, both tried, with differing degrees of sincerity and exertion, to keep the Soviet Union together. What they tried to do was to write a new union treaty that would reshape the Soviet Union for the 21st century and put the relations between the republics on a different basis, one that would hopefully be more durable. But these ideas to somehow shape the Union into a new or looser federation crashed into the Ukrainian desire for self-determination. So rather than agree to the creation of a reformed union, Ukrainian voters sought independence instead, as this audience knows well. And without the second most populous Slavic republic, neither Gorbachev nor Yeltsin could see any viable path forward to a new Soviet Union. Not least because it was clear that Ukraine would serve as a role model for other republics that were similarly hoping to become independent. And Ukraine is, of course, because of its size and significance, a bellwether, and obviously would inspire other countries. The then U.S. President, George H.W. Bush, recognized the significance of Ukraine as well. He hoped that he could sway Ukraine to remain part of the Soviet Union, because he feared if the Soviet Union collapsed, it would become, as he repeatedly said internally, Yugoslavia with nukes. In other words, a country disintegrating to ethnic violence only with nuclear weapons in the mix. This was the origin of his infamous Chicken Kiev speech, when George H.W. Bush went to Kiev and basically tried to dissuade Ukrainians from striving for independence. The irony of the speech was that the U.S. president was actively trying to prolong the existence of America's greatest foe, namely the Soviet Union. But his efforts failed, as all others did, to sway Ukrainian voters and government leaders who nonetheless chose independence. So, Ukraine, of course, famously voted overwhelmingly in favor of independence, and by becoming independent, Ukraine immediately posed a new threat because it was born nuclear. In fact, it was born the third biggest nuclear power in the world, with a significantly bigger arsenal than either Britain, France, or China. And the strategic weapons in that arsenal were pre-programmed to target U.S. cities. And this, of course, immediately got the highest level of attention. I've seen so much documentation on this. George H.W. Bush heard from his advisors that this was a first-rate problem. At one point, the Secretary of State, James Baker, said to him, "Mr. President, there is no issue more deserving of your time or attention than Ukraine right now." That's how important it was. So that's at the point at which I say, Serhiy, I need to know a lot more about Ukraine. So I then began looking into this issue of the denuclearization of Ukraine, which remains a U.S. priority even after George H.W. Bush loses the presidency. In other words, the occupants of the White House change, but the issue remains. Both the George H.W. Bush team and the Clinton team focus on denuclearizing Ukraine, getting those weapons that are targeted at U.S. cities dismantled, destroyed, and so forth. So both Bush and Clinton worked hard throughout the 1990s, and the approach that they landed upon was in cooperation with Moscow. They decided to request that Ukraine return these Soviet weapons, former Soviet weapons, to Russia. Having been scarred by the horrors of the Chernobyl catastrophe on its territory, about which Serhiy has written so eloquently, Ukrainians initially seemed inclined to go along with these plans for denuclearization. But the darkening context of relations in Russia and the post-breakup chaos of the Soviet space started to cause a rethink in Kiev. And Kiev started to think about holding on to its nuclear weapons. So now we get to the second critical historical moment. So the first moment is Ukraine becoming independent and what that means. Now we get to the second moment. To continue to promote denuclearization, the United States, together with Britain and Russia, so this is a moment where U.S. and Russian interests overlap and coincide, offer Kiev the so-called Budapest Memorandum of 1994. That's 25 years ago this December. This accord provides assurances, not guarantees, which is a meaningful difference, assurances of Ukrainian territorial integrity in exchange for continued Ukrainian denuclearization. In other words, Ukraine is starting to back off its initial willingness to give up its nukes, and so now the Budapest Memorandum, these Western assurances of Ukrainian territorial integrity, along with a whole host of aid, are meant to persuade Ukraine to continue that process. Washington also, and this is where the story overlaps my story, spearheaded the establishment of a NATO-related security organization called the Partnership for Peace. The Partnership for Peace was an alternative to NATO expansion, and it included slots for post-Soviet republics. In other words, it was a loose affiliation available to all European states and post-Soviet states. It did not include Article 5 guarantees, which are the heart of the North Atlantic Treaty. Article 5 is the article that requires all allies to regard an attack on themselves as an attack on anyone as an attack on themselves. So an attack on Paris is the same as an attack on Chicago and should in theory require the same response. The Partnership for Peace did not include Article 5 guarantees. It was a loose affiliation, and the idea was that over time, anyone in it could perhaps earn membership by proving itself in the partnership. And this was, as Boris Yeltsin said to Bill Clinton, a brilliant idea because it did not draw a new line through post-Cold War Europe. It included a secure security berth for Ukraine, thereby enhancing Ukrainian security further. So this combination, the Partnership for Peace and the Budapest Memorandum, convinced Ukraine to keep going forward with denuclearization. As Clinton told Yeltsin at the time, this was hugely important. Clinton told Yeltsin that the two of them, the American president and the Russian president, were engaged in a worthy cause together. Quote, "We have the first chance ever since the rise of the nation state to have the entire continent of Europe live at peace." And Clinton told Yeltsin that Ukraine was, quote, "the linchpin, the heart of that effort," and acted accordingly, hence the Partnership for Peace and the Budapest Memorandum. But there were darker sides to that success. As a Ukrainian diplomat confided in his U.S. counterparts in 1994, his country had, quote, "no illusions that the Russians would live up to the agreements that they had signed." The government of Ukraine was instead, by accepting the Budapest Memorandum, quote, "simply hoping to get agreements that will make it possible for Kiev to appeal for assistance in international fora when the Russians violate them." And success also bred complacency in the United States. As the former Soviet weapons departed Ukraine, that country became much less of a priority for Washington. It fell down the priority list. Meanwhile, opponents of the Partnership for Peace grew more and more powerful. The pro-expansion Republican Party won a dramatic victory in the U.S. midterm congressional elections in 1994. And that party, as part of its contract for America, wanted to expand NATO, not in a loose, diffuse fashion across Europe, but in a narrow, targeted fashion to Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. In other words, extend Article 5 guarantees to those countries. And after their electoral victory in the midterm election, they succeeded in achieving that outcome. So subsequently, an important conceptual divergence opened between Washington and Moscow, showing that the U.S.-Russian unity expressed in the Budapest Memorandum had papered over a significant problem. The U.S. had come to accept Ukrainian independence as an accomplished fact, whereas Moscow, in contrast, could not bring itself to accept that Ukraine, with its long and close historical ties to Russia, was now a fully sovereign separate country. As a result of all these developments, Ukraine increasingly found itself left outside the emerging Western post-Cold War order. It saw no clear path to a secure berth in either the main post-Cold War security organization, which turned out to be NATO rather than the Partnership for Peace, or in the European Union. As a result, Ukraine struggled to democratize and fight corruption and its own internal demons in a kind of gray area, living in the shadow of the collapse of the Soviet Empire. So, although not immediately apparent at the time, the efforts of the 1990s to establish a lasting order had thus foundered on Ukrainian shoals once again. The third significant moment was the arrival of Vladimir Putin as prime minister and then president in the early 21st century. As a result of his arrival, the strategic environment became much less permissive for Ukrainian experiments in sovereignty as a result. Now, Putin was initially willing to cooperate with the West, as in after September 11th, but because of his unwillingness to see Ukraine as a truly separate country, he gradually came to see the protests in Ukraine, the Orange Revolution and then later the Maidan protests, as indivisible from the protests inside Russia. In his eyes, they were all one and the same, that is, direct threats to the stability of his regime. He chose to see these protests as the work of foreign instigators, blaming the West in general and U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in particular. So Ukraine thus became yet again a dangerous set of shoals, this time wrecking the promise of post-Cold War US-Russian cooperation. Putin was convinced that the US support for color revolutions, and particularly the Orange Revolution, went well beyond the implicit threat of NATO expansion and represented a direct threat to his country, to his regime, and to himself. And he, of course, as we all know, responded not only with the invasion of Georgia in 2008, but also with, of course, the events of 2014. But we now know that Putin's desire to fight back against this perceived Western attack did not end with annexing Crimea. The year 2016 was, of course, the 25th anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which Putin views as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, despite the fact that there's a lot of competition for that tragic title. He was hardly going to organize a parade to mark that event. Instead, he decided to mark that anniversary by avenging himself on the United States and Hillary Clinton by hacking the US election in favor of her opponent. So all these events show that when Ukraine does not have a secure berth in either economic or security terms, the consequences are profound. As former US Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch has written, Ukraine has Russia on its east, the warm waters of the oil-rich Black Sea to its south, and 4 NATO allies to its west. It is a critical hinge in international relations. So in conclusion, we now face the 4th moment when political order is foundering on the shoals of Ukraine. That moment arose with the decision of Donald Trump to hire a man named Paul Manafort as his campaign manager. With that choice, Trump established a conduit that allowed spillover from Ukraine to flow directly into his campaign and now into his presidency. This spillover now mixes dangerously with Trump's gullibility in the face of Putin's claims that, contrary to the consensus of the US intelligence community, Moscow is blameless in the 2016 election hacking. As the transcripts, such as this one, and text released in October 2019 show, Trump is now engaged personally in an effort to prove, despite all evidence to the contrary, that the hacking was in favor not of himself, but of Hillary Clinton, and that the hacking came not from Russia, but from Ukraine. The end consequence may very well be that the latest victim of the Ukrainian shoals will be the US presidency itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mary. Next speaker is yourself.
Yeah, so I think with the caveat that was just given, I'll follow with my own caveat. So I have a Ukrainian last name. I have lived in Ukraine. I'm probably not the best qualified person to talk about US politics. People continually used to ask me, why don't I study United States politics? And I would tell them that United States politics is boring compared to politics in Eastern Europe. I can no longer say that. Trump is truly the gift that keeps on giving from a political science perspective. So what I want to do is just very quickly walk you through some of the main points of what's happened essentially since July of this year up till the present. Events, as you know, if you've been following this, and I think most of you, if you're here, have been following these unfolding developments, are happening very quickly. So I don't want to spend too much time on this. I'd rather leave some of that for Q&A, because I think, first of all, you're familiar with many of these developments, and secondly, this is very much an ongoing process. However, so events began in, for what I'm talking about, events began in July of 25 with this now infamous phone call, the partial transcript of which was released, and I'd love to hear more about how partial this is later on. But the key part of this phone call that's raised trouble on the US side is that it's raised 2 really important questions. It's raised questions of campaign finance and allegations that campaign finance laws may have been violated in a quid pro quo arrangement. That's been refuted by parts of the government, but there are still some political players that are pushing that. And the second of this is that it's raised the question of to what degree is President Trump looking to profit personally, meaning in the next election cycle in 2020, from this arrangement with the Ukrainian president. Now, the problematic aspects of the call centered on 2 factors. The first of these was how can I phrase this? The alleged looking into the actions of Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, and Joe Biden by extension. Specifically, Hunter Biden's work with the Burisma Group in Ukraine, for which he was allegedly paid somewhere up to $50,000 a month in consulting fees. Now, Burisma Group is owned by the Ukrainian oligarch Mykola Zlochevsky. Mykola Zlochevsky has been investigated more than once for alleged embezzlement and alleged corruption, money laundering charges. The background of this dates back to while Joe Biden was still vice president in the Obama administration, that he had made U.S. support for Ukraine's government and also support for further funding contingent on anti-corruption measures being put into place, and one of these was the removal, one of these conditions was the removal of the Ukrainian prosecutor, a man at the time by the name of Shokin, from his position. The Ukrainian prosecutor was opening an investigation into Zlochevsky's dealings. Again, this is the owner of the Burisma Group, which is where Hunter Biden eventually ended up being employed. Shokin was removed from power. He was replaced eventually by another man by the name of Lutsenko as the chief prosecutor of Ukraine. Lutsenko eventually ended up dropping the investigation. There has to date been, despite a lot of digging, there has been no credible evidence found of malfeasance on either Hunter Biden's part or on Joe Biden's part. However, for obvious reasons, Hunter Biden is not an oil specialist. I think that's probably a fair way of describing him. And he doesn't have any other contact that we know of to Ukraine or to China, where there are also allegations of profiting from political connections of his father. So it raises some issues in a lot of people's minds. This is something that the Trump administration has been fomenting very actively. The second part of this has to do with this idea of where the hacking attempt in the last election originated from. In the United States, in far-right circles, there has been this conspiracy theory floating around one of the data analytics firms that the U.S. used to confirm the Russian involvement in this process. This is a firm called CrowdStrike, based in California. CrowdStrike was founded by a naturalized U.S. citizen, but originally of Soviet origin. So the idea here behind the conspiracy theory is that you have a disgruntled Ukrainian who has a personal axe to grind with Vladimir Putin. Again, there isn't any solid evidence for this, but this is a conspiracy theory that's been floating around the blogosphere for a very long time, and it looks like our current president has picked up on this. I'll remind you that President Trump has skirted the edge of legality on foreign interference in U.S. Campaign laws more than once. So while he was still actively campaigning for the presidency, he urged Russia, in a joking fashion, but nonetheless, he did urge Russia to look into those 30,000 missing emails, as he put it, on the DNC servers. More recently, in October of this year, he came out and he said that Ukraine and China should look into Joe Biden's son. So obviously, there are political factors involved here that are causing a great deal of umbrage to many Democrats and are leading to the current situation. But what happened in the immediate aftermath of this July 25th phone call, incidentally, Zelensky's team, the Ukrainian team, pushed, it looks like, very hard to have the transcript not released, or at least not released with the Ukrainian part of the conversation on the record. For those of you who've read the conversation, you probably understand why Zelensky comes off as rather obsequious in this, to say the least. But events unfolded very quickly after that. The problem is that Trump's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, who is referenced in this phone call along with William Barr, the Attorney General, has come off as running something along the lines of a shadow government. It's not quite clear when Giuliani was speaking in his own voice, when he was speaking on behalf of Donald Trump as a client, or when he was speaking as some form of emissary for the State Department or for the wider United States government. So Giuliani had a meeting in Madrid in early August, right after a week after this phone call, with Andrei Yermak, who is an advisor to President Zelensky. President Zelensky's other advisor, Serhiy Leshchenko, has gone on the record. He's since sort of walked this back, but he went on the record as saying that Zelensky coming to Washington and having a meeting with President Trump was contingent on the Ukrainian prosecutor's office launching this investigation into the Bidens. So there does seem to be an appearance of some quid pro quo, at least on the surface of it, going on here. As you know, events unfolded very quickly with the whistleblower stepping forward. The complaint was lodged at the end of August, I believe it was. The Washington Post broke the story in September. A second whistleblower stepped forward in early October. So we're waiting to see what this all leads to. The impeachment process is beginning. Impeachment, as you may know, sadly, I told you I was not a U.S. expert, I had to look this up, involves the two houses. It involves the House of Representatives with a straight majority voting to begin impeachment proceedings, and then it involves the actual trial in the Senate where you need a supermajority. It's not quite clear what the Democrats will actually be able to accomplish. The Republicans have so far, with a couple of notable exceptions, Mitt Romney being one of them, have circled the wagons around their man, it looks like. But again, as I said, I'm happy to talk about this in more detail. Events are unfolding very quickly. The aid that President Trump suspended, the $400 million in military aid that was suspended in June. It was initially reported as being suspended in July. It was actually suspended in June, was released, or at least it was put into process in September, on September 11th. As of Friday, the defense websites were reporting that Javelin missile sale was actually going through now to Ukraine. What this actually means for Ukraine's security is something we could talk about further in the conversation. Probably not all that much from indications. But again, events are unfolding very quickly. Rudolph Giuliani is now under investigation. Two of his close associates, Lev Parnas and Igor Furman, have been arrested for campaign finance violations and for looking to influence, among other things, the removal of the prior U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Fiona Hill, President Trump's Russia advisor, just recently gave testimony, in closed-door testimony. So a lot of moving parts here that, again, I'm happy to get into in the Q&A, but I think this is sort of the general outline, if you will, and the main talking points of what's currently going on. And maybe, yeah, let me stop there and give other people a chance to talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Justice is on next.
So to follow suit, I also don't have a Ukrainian last name, but I have done extensive field work in Ukraine since 2012. I'm an anthropologist by training, and most of my research took place during 10 months of the Euromaidan protests when I was doing research with some student activists. And so one of the things that I want to talk about in the time that I have here is the importance of protest and mass movement and how that sort of shapes a lot of what's going on in Ukraine today, and also how that sort of led up to Zelensky being such an important figure in terms of hope for the future, potential for democratic development. So there's going to be a little bit of overlap with what George said, but hopefully it'll help sort of bring together all of our key players who seem to keep appearing over and over. So starting in 2000, it's the first kind of post-independence major mass mobilization. This is called the Ukraine Without Kuchma movement. This is in response to then President Leonid Kuchma's apparent involvement, participation in the disappearance and murder of Georgy Gongadze, who was an investigative journalist. These protests were, mass participation, but crackdowns on behalf of the police sort of led to these protests fizzling out. Kuchma ultimately wasn't removed from power, and we could even argue that he actually consolidated his power because of his kind of aggressive response to the protests. So then we turn to 2004, when we have the Orange Revolution, which a lot of you probably also paid attention to. Leonid Kuchma, after he left office, handpicked Viktor Yanukovych as his successor. He was running in the 2004 elections against Viktor Yushchenko, who was ultimately kind of more popular, more Western-leaning, and exit polls after the election showed that Yushchenko was set to win. But of course, the elections were decided in favor of Yanukovych instead. Again, people massed in the streets. They protested from November 2004 until January in 2005. There were new elections that were held. Yushchenko is finally declared the winner. But unfortunately for Yushchenko, he is kind of steamrolled by lots of opposition in parliament. He doesn't actually have enough power to put forth the reforms that were sort of the goals of the protest and his original campaign goals. So he actually has to make a coalition government, and he names Yanukovych his prime minister in 2006. And so the disappointment with the Orange regime comes to a head in the 2010 elections. Yushchenko runs again, and he only wins 5.4% of the vote. In those 2010 elections, Yanukovych wins. For the most part, there's general agreement that those were fair elections. I have heard people who have claimed that they were absolutely not fair elections, but we didn't see a kind of large-scale protest response to those, which could either be explained, I think, by people sort of accepting that these were fair elections, and also probably by people sort of being tired of coming out and protesting and then being disappointed in their candidate again. But of course, as we know, Yanukovych, who campaigned again on kind of promises of bringing Ukraine into the orbit of Europe, at the last minute decides not to sign the association agreement with the European Union, which would bring Ukraine into economic agreement with Europe. Instead, he decides to ally with President Putin, sign the customs union agreement, and at this point people again respond. They come into the streets in 2013. That's a picture that I took in December of 2013. These become mass mobilizations. Usually we hear that they end in February of 2014, which is when mass uprising happened. Violence was committed against protesters. 100 people are killed in the streets. Yanukovych is ousted. He flees to Russia. The Euromaidan activists install an interim government, and then they hold elections in May of 2014 when Petro Poroshenko is brought into office. And here is where I'm going to intervene and talk a little bit about the role of oligarchs in Ukraine. Because we know that Poroshenko is an oligarch. He made his money through his candy company, Roshen, which is the biggest candy company in Ukraine. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of other people whose names have been circulating of late. And the interesting similarities between them is that they also all have influence in the media as well, which is something we can talk about a little more in Q&A. So Poroshenko also owns Pyatый Kanal, Fifth Channel, which was sort of at the time of Euromaidan kind of an opposition channel, broadcast a lot of footage of the protests. And I screenshotted what was on their website yesterday, and it was covering protests about the recently proposed Steinmeier formula, which is a solution to the end of to end the conflict in the Donbass. Again, something we can talk about more. I thought that was kind of interesting. Our second oligarch, Igor Kolomoisky, he is the owner of Privatbank, which you have probably also been reading a lot about. He also made money in a lot of different fields, but Privatbank is his kind of biggest enterprise. He owns the channel 1+1, which, as we know, broadcast the TV show Servant of the People, featuring Volodymyr Zelensky, who plays a history teacher, ordinary history teacher, who gets elected president after a viral video. So we know that there's a connection between Kolomoisky and Zelensky. And if you watch the show, by the way, it is a little eerie how many things come up in that show that also come up in Zelensky's real policy. It's on Netflix. I recommend it.
He's put in jail in that show.
I haven't
Are you
gotten there
predicting
yet.
that? I'm sorry.
Spoiler. I'm only in the first season, but anyway.
I apologize.
I should have known. It's been out for you. At any rate, so our last oligarch who matters right now is Dmytro Firtash, who made most of his money in chemical and engineering fields, and he owns the Inter Group, media group, which is a conglomeration of several different channels. When I screenshotted their news page, it wasn't talking about Ukrainian politics at all. It was really just talking about what's going on their channels. So Firtash is going to come back again in the next slide, so just wait for him. to reappear. Just to reiterate, this is kind of mostly what George went over, but I want to talk a little bit about the prosecutors general because that brings together several of the names that we've been talking about so far. So we were talking about Joe Biden's son Hunter being a board member of Burisma Holdings. The Prosecutor General's office under Shokin has launched an investigation into Zlochevsky, the oligarch who owns this company. This investigation is around fraud and money laundering, but there has not been an investigation of Hunter Biden's presence on the board, nor of Joe Biden's interest in the companies. And actually, there's a lot of international kind of high-powered people who are on the board of that company. And if you look at a lot of these big companies, they also feature these very high-profile international board members. So Burisma is not actually very unique in this structure, in my sense of it. So Shokin is he's the Prosecutor General from 2015 to 2016. One of the really important parts to this story is that lots of people start to see him as really incompetent at his job. He is not prosecuting top officials for corruption. There are supposed to be cases being brought against the police officers who murdered Euromaidan protesters. Those cases aren't moving forward. He's not moving forward prosecuting Yanukovych for his crimes against the country. And so a lot of people start to see him as stagnating this position. And so people from civil society, from NGOs, from anti-corruption organizations are all calling for him to be fired. So when Joe Biden joins this conversation during his term as vice president, this call has kind of been out in the open. So he's just joining into a chorus of voices that already exist. Shokin gets fired in April of 2016. Yuri Lutsenko starts this job in May of 2016. Lutsenko, you may remember, was imprisoned for his connections with Yulia Tymoshenko under the Yanukovych regime. He became kind of a prominent figure during Euromaidan as somebody who had represented the previous attempts to reform Ukraine into a stable democracy. So he comes into power here, and he is not investigating Burisma Holdings, but just to sort of point out, Lutsenko does do an interview with John Solomon from The Hill, and in this interview happens in March of 2019, so Lutsenko is already kind of at the end of his tenure. In the interview, he suggests that Biden has put undue pressure on the Ukrainian government to fire Shokin to protect his son and Burisma Holdings. And so The Hill publishes this interview as a legitimate claim without investigating it, and it becomes kind of fodder for the claims made by the Giuliani-Trump camp that Biden is in fact meddling in Ukraine's affairs. So moving on to President Trump's Ukraine connections, which really just forces the point that maybe the Bidens are meddling in Ukraine, but also Trump has connections in Ukraine that should give us pause as well. Paul Manafort, of course, being the closest connection. Manafort was the campaign manager for Trump and the campaign advisor for Yanukovych during those intervening years between which Yanukovych lost the presidency in 2004 and gained it in 2010. So to some extent, Manafort is credited with changing the image of Yanukovych into somebody who is more electable. Relatedly, Serhiy Leshchenko, who came up as well, investigative journalist, civil society activist, former MP. Leshchenko publishes the Black Ledger, which is the party accounting books from Yanukovych's Party of Regions. And in this Black Ledger, we find evidence that Manafort has been paid $12 million unofficially from the party. And so for these types of illegal practices, Manafort gets 7.5 years in prison. He's charged with tax and bank fraud, as well as some other crimes, and of course he's resigned from his position in the Trump campaign. But Leshchenko, of course, then became an advisor to Zelensky, but then has been kind of on the outs and did not win re-election this year, so his positioning here, I think, is really interesting. So then we also know, just to reiterate, that Giuliani has been working with Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman, who are helping him investigate the claims about Biden that advocate for Shokin's firing. And here's where Firtash comes back into play. Both of these gentlemen have been working with Firtash in as yet unknown capacity in part as translators for Firtash. So there's kind of connection here between these guys who are working with Giuliani. They've also been working with Firtash. Giuliani these men were helping Giuliani set up meetings with Ukrainian officials, including Shokin, Lutsenko, and Zelensky in Ukraine, although these meetings never happened because Giuliani decided not to go to Ukraine. So just if I can take just a few more minutes to talk a little bit about Zelensky and why it's so important here that Zelensky's potential relationship with Trump has the possibility to be really influential on his presidency. He has no political experience. Poroshenko did a lot of things during his tenure as president that he said he would do. He changed a lot of, he won autocephaly for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. He passed language laws to promote the Ukrainian language. He supported the military in a lot of ways. These were his campaign slogans. And yet, he only won 24% of the vote in the presidential elections in 2019. So there's an important idea that Zelensky kind of has a lot of weight on his shoulders right now. An unaccomplished politician who nobody really knows anything about. He also managed to win, his party managed to win the majority in parliament by a lot. And so he has a supermajority, which is completely unprecedented in Ukraine. And so the question is, what is he going to do with it? So on the one hand, he has come through with some of his campaign promises, like removing immunity from prosecution for members of parliament. So theoretically, this supports anti-corruption campaigns because people can't just get away with having whatever ties they want with prioritizing whatever interests they want. Again, he's seeking to resolve the conflict in the Donbass through the Steinmeier formula. It's really unpopular in a lot of places in Ukraine. It's a really important debate. I don't know if this is the place for it, but it's controversial. It's maybe not a great idea, but the idea is that he's distancing himself from Poroshenko, who sort of starts to be seen as stagnating on that issue as well. So theoretically, he's trying to achieve things that Poroshenko could not. However, he also could be very strongly connected to Kolomoisky and Igor Kolomoisky's interests in Ukraine, including retaking control of Privatbank. So just a couple of things. Kolomoisky's bank was nationalized after $5.5 billion were missing. The government decided to nationalize it to protect the interests of the bank's customers. At this point, Kolomoisky flees for Israel, claiming that Poroshenko is targeting him politically instead of, treating this in a fair way. But since Poroshenko has left office, Kolomoisky has returned to Ukraine, and a Kiev district court found that the nationalization of the bank was actually illegal. So this sort of sets up for Kolomoisky to be in a position of more power. And here we can see next to Zelensky on the left is Andriy Bogdan, who was Kolomoisky's former lawyer, who Zelensky hired as his head of administration. So there's some overlaps here that are not great in terms of thinking about Zelensky as an independent figure. I'm going to stop there. Let's turn it over to Margarita and hear some more about oil and gas. Thank you.
Oh, this is a danger.
Yeah.
A lot of danger here. What happens if I close this? Nobody will die? Okay. Maybe I need to.
Oh, we just have it, yeah.
Okay. Escape?
Oh,
Yeah, there's a map of it.
Okay, good. Well, you have survived the first half an hour of our event, so I hope you can survive 10 more minutes. The first question that emerges in this kind of discussion, and the first question I thought about when I got the information about the event is, why Ukraine? Why is it that exactly Ukraine has become the crux of this important crisis in American politics? And I think the first way to answer this, the first gut reaction to this would be, and certainly I think it is the dominant narrative, probably because it has to do with corruption, and Ukraine is impossible to separate from the issue of corruption. And you would imagine that as somebody who 10 years ago wrote a book about corruption in Ukraine, about energy corruption in Ukraine, I would agree with this view. But I don't. I actually think that there is something even more important at play, even more important than Ukraine as a crux of corruption. And I think that that thing that is more important is the issue of sanctions, sanctions against Russia, and the way those sanctions have been key to Mr. Trump's unofficial policy vis-a-vis Russia, that is the desire to lift those sanctions, have been key to Donald Trump's unofficial policy vis-a-vis Russia, a policy that is at odds with the policies pursued by any elected body in this country. And this relates to energy because sanctions issues are very, very closely related to energy value chains. Energy value chains, which in turn are very, very much related to Ukraine. Historically, and even today, Ukraine has been key to the value chains of Russian energy exports in natural gas, in oil, also in coal. We don't have time here for a historical look back, but Ukraine, since 1991, has been key to transforming Russia's energy riches into actual dollars or euros. Therefore, I'm not surprised that Ukraine is very important in the question of sanctions that have to do with energy, and I am not surprised that Ukraine is important because sanctions are related to what Russia has done in Ukraine. So let me try to relate this more directly to energy issues. In the last 4.5 years, I have been working on a book, let's call it a book on energy value chains from Siberia to Brussels. From what I have heard in the last 10 days, I realized that these energy chains actually extend, at least politically, up to Washington. So let me take a quick look at the ways in which the impeachment story, or the impeachment cloud issue that we have been seeing in intense manner in the last 10 days, intersects with each of these chains that I studied in my book. And these are not only oil and gas chains, they're also coal chains, which is a topic everybody neglects, but it's really, really important for understanding Ukraine and Russia. As it turns out, each of these energy value chains is very closely related to a key oligarch in Ukraine. In the case of natural gas, Dmytro Firtash. In the case of oil, Mr. Kolomoisky. In the case of coal, Mr. Akhmetov. And in the next couple of minutes, I just want to give you a glimpse of how these value chains are related to the cloud that we are facing in the last week and in the last months. Let me start with natural gas. One key element in the story that has emerged in the last week has to do with the attempts by Mr. Frugman and Mr. Parnas. We have already mentioned them earlier today. Individuals related to Mr. Giuliani and in turn related to Mr. Trump to push Ukraine to a different natural gas supply policy. So there has been a lot of discussion about whether they sought to influence the president of Ukraine, to push away the CEO of Ukraine's state energy company, NAK, Naftogaz Ukraini, Mr. Kobylev, in favor of another person who would be more interested in purchasing liquefied natural gas, not only from the US, but from a company related to their interests and to the interests of the US Secretary of Energy. That issue of liquefied natural gas is really important for our story because it relates to a key narrative the US has been pushing in the last 4 years. A narrative of the fact that US surplus natural gas, the possibility of the US exporting natural gas, the possibility of the US exporting natural gas, not only because of its surplus, but because of its possibility of being exported as liquefied natural gas, not pipeline gas. The narrative of that natural gas saving Europe from Russia, or saving Ukraine from Russia. So the attempts to pursue the interests of a private company to sell that liquefied natural gas in Ukraine fold into this larger narrative. In reality, however, if you look at price trends, if you look at infrastructure issues, it's going to be very, very difficult for that liquefied natural gas to really be competitive in Europe and especially Ukraine. But the point here is that you have an official narrative that is supporting the role of private actors in a private/official foreign policy. Part of the LNG story also has to do with the idea of, again, replacing one CEO of NAC Naftogaz with another person. Another way in which the natural gas value chain comes into the story has to do with the connection with Mr. Firtash. We know very, very little about that connection. We only know that the two individuals who were active trying to change the leadership of NAC Naftogaz were also in contact with Firtash. Firtash has been the #1 natural gas person in Ukraine for the last 15 years. I don't know the details, but that can turn out to be something very, very important. And of course, we all know that he's suspected of having very close contacts with Russian underground criminal individuals. The natural gas value chain finally comes in through the issue of the Burisma group. We have already talked about that briefly, and here it has to do, again, with whether Hunter Biden was involved in corruption through that group, but also it is related to the issue of how licenses for the production of natural gas in Ukraine are adjudicated. So we have here natural gas in a variety of ways. And this is really important because all of this is happening as Ukraine is facing 3 key challenges concerning natural gas. First, the possible, and until now very, very unsuccessful renegotiation of NAC Naftogaz transit agreement with Gazprom, which is going to expire on December 31st. And it's not clear what will come after that. That is key to Ukraine because natural gas transit has been very important for Ukraine. Secondly, the question, very much related to the first one, of the future of the Nord Stream pipeline supplying gas around Ukraine, that is supplying gas not through transit via Ukraine but through other means, which again has been key to the official US rhetoric on Ukraine, an official rhetoric which has portrayed the US as pro-Ukrainian, while de facto the parallel policy pursued by President Trump has been a different one. And finally, natural gas is key because exactly as we speak, the unbundling of Ukraine's largest and key natural gas company, state-owned natural gas company, is taking place. The transit part of this company is going to be separated from the production and distribution parts of this company. It's possible that this company will get bankrupt. So there are a lot of things happening in the natural gas value chain, and any US interference in this area can be very problematic and very crucial. But natural gas is not the only story. We also have the oil value chain that is extremely important here. And the connection with the oil value chain takes place not only through the whole issue of the connections between Mr. Zelensky and Mr. Kolomoisky, through the Privat Bank, through the Privat Group, which is central for oil refining, but oil is key because oil is key in terms of US sanctions vis-a-vis Russia. The strongest US sanctions vis-a-vis Russia have to do with Russia's ability to use imports from the US, to use investments from the US, to engage in fracking, to engage in Arctic oil exploration, and to engage in deep water exploration. So oil is very important to this story, not directly through oil that is produced in Ukraine, maybe that will come up later, but through the issue of sanctions. And finally, the coal value chain becomes very important as well. Again, this is something we normally don't talk about because we don't consider coal to be important. When we talk about coal, we know that coal in and of itself has never been profitable in Ukraine. On the contrary, it has been a major source of deficits. But one aspect of coal is key to the value chain, that is the connection between coal and metallurgy and in particular steel exports, where the largest or the second largest export for Ukraine in the 2000s. And they are key again in the story because one key oligarch, Mr. Rinat Akhmetov, the number one rich person in Ukraine in terms of wealth, and the number one person in the Ukrainian coal sector, has been.
Shut the light up. Sorry. You can just shut it.
How?
Like close
Just all the
it.
way.
Maybe.
Okay. Mr. Akhmetov has been key to the Manafort connection in the larger scandal. And if you move from metallurgy as related to steel into metallurgy more broadly, including aluminum, and again, I'm not going to get here into a technical explanation of the differences, another key player comes in, that is Mr. Deripaska, Oleg Deripaska, who is the main person behind Paul Manafort's attempt to change the Republican Party's stance vis-a-vis sanctions and vis-a-vis Ukraine, because the strongest sanctions that the US got involved with were sanctions against his aluminum producing company, Rusal. So what I have tried to show is how different types of energy interact with the scandal in a broad understanding of the scandal. If we had more time, I will tell you more about how the material characteristics of each type of energy help explain how they interact with this and other things, but let's do that some other time. And what I want to emphasize here is that we have seen in the US a double policy vis-a-vis Ukraine, a rhetoric that is pro-Ukrainian and makes a lot of noise about apparent European abandonment of Ukraine, and about US possibly saving Ukraine through its policy on Nord Stream and through LNG, but also a policy that has been de facto pro-Russian. What I'm really afraid of is that the current US meddling in Ukraine is going to play into Russian hands. Russia is undoubtedly going to use this to minimize its own involvement in Ukraine. But what I find most troubling is that in the same way as the Russian intervention in eastern Ukraine has very often been misnamed as a Ukrainian crisis, I'm very afraid that the current US intervention in Ukraine is going to be misnamed as a Ukrainian crisis as well. Thank you.
I want to thank all of our presenters and for trying their best to stick to 10 minutes limit that was established at the beginning. For those of you who were waiting for easy answers to the question, why Ukraine? I guess we didn't get easy answers, but we got a lot of answers, and it's a really complex story. So I think it's a good time maybe to open floor for questions and comments, and I'm prepared here to help moderate the discussion. So who would like to ask the first question? Yes, Josh, please.
Can I get up with this question so that I can project better? I found all of these talks very interesting, but I found one thing somehow missing, and that is closer attention to and reference to political culture, which answers some of the issues involved. To say that George H.W. Bush supporting Russia or seeming to be on the same page as Russia, arguing that the Soviet Union should be maintained, and it is, however he put it, fantasy or reckless nationalism or something to that effect, is only to touch on the surface of the matter, because the issue has been from there to now that Ukraine has been treated by the US and by various Western states as a second-class citizen. And that border that was created, where some countries were capable of being part of NATO, like Poland, of course, and Hungary, of course, and the Czech Republic and Slovakia, of course, but also Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia, and Ukraine was not, has left deep scars in the Ukrainian psyche. You know, apart from how it is seen by us supposedly as neutral and as objective observers. And the center of, or the core of Putin's understanding of Ukraine is that it is not a country, is that it is a mistake of a country, that it is a wannabe country. And in this kind of argument that I'm making, it is essential to note that Ukraine has done everything possible to prove him right. That is to say, Ukrainian political culture has been precisely the kind of culture, political culture, that does not demonstrate or affirm its independence and its true, as it were, Western. I mean, only now, after the Maidan of 2013, has this become an issue of common, supposedly, understanding. But then we have this election. And how does that reflect on political culture? You know, I think that clearly this could go on and turn into a rant, but these are very important issues. Because, you know, the Zelensky election, for many people who are following Ukrainian affairs, is dire. Because we have no guarantee that he will not make some kind of a deal with Putin that will bring back these DNR and LNR, which are there in the corner on the right, you know, into the body politic. And it's like transplanting a gangrenous arm back to a body. There is no discussion of it now, and I wonder what kind of discussion will be possible given the circumstances are developing. I wonder how you would comment on that.
Okay, thanks. Maybe I'll collect a number of questions so that then each of you would have a chance to comment on a particular maybe question. Again, please.
Hey, thank you all for very interesting presentations. I would still like to, for the presenters to elaborate, why is it exactly Ukraine? So there's kind of a key position that Mary Sarati discussed in kind of the European security architecture. But really in this particular incidence of the impeachment hearings, is it just an accident that Biden was on the board of this Ukrainian company? Did it just happen that, you know, Paul Manafort had some past dealings with Ukraine? Why really is it Ukraine? You know, for instance, what do you have the popular protests to do with all of this business? If you could just maybe hone in on that point.
Okay, thank you. And maybe one more question or comment? Yes, please.
Okay, so the impeachment proceedings, if they're limited to Ukraine, and they may not be, since there's no real clear definition of impeachment, and it could go off into all different tangents since it's politically motivated, essentially, anyways. But the question about Ukraine, in its essence, is did influence trading occur, where the president said, we'll hold back or we'll release the military funding to you in exchange for your doing our bidding in investigating this important political question. But the underlying assumption is that the United States owes military aid to Ukraine in the first place. I expect the impeachment proceedings are going to blow over because each house is going to vote on partisan lines. But we still haven't determined why is the United States giving $400 million to Ukraine. There are no American interests in Ukraine other than trying to further encircle and entrench hostile forces against Russia. So if we can improve American relations with Russia, which the president is attempting to do, we may not need to give $400 million to a corrupt government which siphons off all of this money in the first place. So we need to get these American and Russian relations straightened out before we can understand why America is giving $400 million in aid to Ukraine in the first place, though.
Okay, good. So we have 3 questions, comments, and again, who would like to start here?
I just want to take a first shot at this. Why Ukraine? I offer my own explanation of why Ukraine, but basically the reason that comment was made in that phone call vis-a-vis Ukraine and not vis-a-vis another country is because Ukraine was vulnerable. Because Ukraine needs that US military aid desperately to survive. That, in a narrow understanding, is why Ukraine. Why does Ukraine need $400 million of US aid? We have just heard how important Ukraine is to the survival of a European security architecture. And my fear here, and we have been talking about political culture, is we seem to forget that Ukraine exists. I spend a lot of time in Germany. I'm not here to bash against Germany, but very often when I travel in Eastern Germany, people ask me exactly the same. We killed so many people in Russia during the Second World War. Why do we have to create a crisis with Russia again? How about Ukraine? Where was Ukraine during the Second World War? So
Well,
please, let's not forget that Ukraine
essentially,
exists.
a lot of them are on the side of the Nazis, unfortunately. And now you have S-14 that wants to scuttle relations with
Okay,
Russia.
let's give other participants of the round table to comment on that.
Yeah, just to build on what Professor Balmaceda said, it's an excellent question. And by the way, for those of you who know, Mariana Bujarin is basically the world expert on Ukrainian denuclearization. So her dissertation is hopefully coming out soon.
As a book.
As a book, yes. Exactly because Ukraine is such a hinge country. I thought that quotation from Marie Jovanovich's testimony was excellent, right? It borders Russia, it borders the oil-rich waters of the Black Sea, it borders NATO country. It's a hinge country, and as I said in my remarks, if there is no secure berth for Ukraine, then the entire Eurasian continent suffers. So that's the heart of the problem. And then, as you rightly said, because of the decisions in the 1990s, which left Ukraine on the outside of the post-Cold War order, that problem just festers, right? So that's why, in general, Ukraine is just a sore point, a wounded part of Eurasia. It's why specifically it comes up now has to do with Paul Manafort, right? So it's an interesting collision of these sort of broader historical forces with individual choices. And when Trump chose Paul Manafort to be his campaign manager, that sets up a tricky connection. And then, of course, because of what Donald Trump's psyche does, right? He's trying to find some way out of this narrative that he's president because Russia hacked on his behalf. When things come up with regard to Ukraine that seem promising, and Ukraine, as you said, is vulnerable, it can be pressured, that seems like a way out. So there's both a broader context, which is this ongoing problem in European security, and this specific individual connection, and that sort of come together in the perfect storm, and that's why Ukraine's coming out.
Okay, thanks.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I think this question of political culture is really important and actually intersects back with the idea of popular protest and the idea of vulnerability, because popular protests and their kind of continual recurrence, I think, shows that the change that people are after hasn't yet been achieved. And so that's the actual reforms in political culture that people are looking for still, I think, haven't totally manifested themselves. And so Zelensky, his election in this context, I think it's hard to say. The voter turnout was low, right? That was one of the most significant things to come out of his election. Voter turnout was at an all-time low, yet he won by an unprecedented amount. So what is that actually telling us about political culture? Are people more apolitical, a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? Baidushny, I can't remember it in English. Indifferent, thank you very much. So people are more indifferent, they're not willing to go back into the streets, but we've also seen all these protests in response to the Steinmeier formula as well. So I think that's also part of the vulnerability. We understand that people aren't trusting their government to do the right thing, and so there's a kind of way to infiltrate. I think that Putin capitalizes on that as much as humanly possible, to some extent by trying to discredit the protesters, but also by showing, that Ukraine's representatives aren't necessarily, the population doesn't necessarily support them 100%, and so that presents a kind of vulnerability where the political culture is basically people don't agree with how that political culture exists, and so how can they actually change that? Historically, replacing one political representative with somebody else hasn't always worked, so maybe we need to start thinking of other solutions, but Zelensky, I guess, is part of that shift.
I guess just very quickly, if I could add a couple of points of amplification. I agree with what all the other panel members have said, but I think, taking this backwards, the question of why does Ukraine need $400 million of U.S. military aid? The fact of the matter is, the question you're essentially asking, does Ukraine have a right to be a sovereign state? Does Ukraine have the right to make its own foreign policy? or is it a vassal state of Russia to some degree? Obviously, if you feel that it's a vassal state of Russia, if you have this idea of some wider conception of a neo-imperial Russian empire, you'll answer no. But if you think that Ukraine does have the right to make its own sovereign decisions, you will say that this is not properly the purview of Moscow to decide. This is properly the purview of Kiev and any powers that want to help them to decide. This military aid, by the way, was talked about, approved far before any of this controversy began in the summer, right? It was only in June that it was suspended, but the appropriation had happened way before then. In terms of why Ukraine, was this an accident? I think, as Maria and the others have pointed out, it was a confluence of factors. But I think that the key point here is that, to my mind, this is still a deflection from Russian meddling. The whole conspiracy theory aspect of this, the whole focus on CrowdStrike, is intended to deflect. Now, I have no idea if our president or those around him in his heart of hearts believes this or not. But the reality of it is, it functions to deflect attention from Russian meddling in our election. On the final point, the question of political culture is a wonderful question. I constantly fight with my colleagues in political science that culture matters. A lot of political scientists don't believe this, but maybe that's a little bit unfair. But I would say in Ukraine, we have to talk about political cultures. Now, we have more of a unified political culture, as you, Professor Grabovich, pointed out correctly, after Euromaidan. But I think what we can't forget is that there's still, it's a multivocal political culture at best right now even. In terms of NATO, let me just end with this. I think one really important thing to keep in mind is it's not even, or it's not limited to Ukraine's desire to be in NATO or not be in NATO. We all know how fraught of a question this has been since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The question is also, can NATO swallow Ukraine? Right? And what concerns me is that we have opinion polling from Germany, from France, that shows increasingly populations in those countries do not want Ukraine to join NATO, and they are willing to punish politicians that push for this. Now, I will say that Ukraine has also done, under Poroshenko in particular, has also done things to shoot itself in the foot. One of the key things has been pushing away its staunchest ally geopolitically in the region, which has been Poland. It's pushed Poland away over what I consider to be some symbolic issues that aren't actually that critical to the current geopolitical situation, but in particular, these April 2015 decommunization laws that have proven to be a real stumbling block for Poland. In particular, how to view some of the Ukrainian, what the current Ukrainian side would characterize as nationalist freedom fighters that have also participated in crimes against Polish ethnic population in places like Volhynia and Eastern Galicia, right? So, I hope that Ukrainian political culture can both unify and can present a concerted front to the world, because Ukraine deserves to be heard. That's my basic point.
Thank you. Yes, please.
I have two follow-up questions based on the discussion, and I guess the first one just follows from what was just said, which is, we're talking about Europe and how it sees Ukraine and how the United States sees Ukraine. And I'm wondering if, with everything that's going on in this country, in recent news of an EU-Russia rapprochement, we're moving to a new order of world politics that's going to move closer perhaps to that vassal state model because of what's happening in this country. In other words, are we getting to a place where the world gets carved up by empires because the United States is no longer seen as a reliable partner and people have to do what they will? So that's one question. And the second has to do with this denuclearization policy, because I think that's fascinating. Mary, I recall you were saying in previous work that post-Cold War, the idea was we would still stick it to the Russians because we could, George H.W. Bush famously, but insisting that Ukraine denuclearize seems to go somehow against that. Because if you really want to make life hard for Russia, the way to do it is to make sure that the Ukrainians keep their nukes and aim them at Moscow. Did anyone ever contemplate that? In some ways, it's an amped up, terrifying version of the let's get the Ukrainians aid now argument. And if it wasn't contemplated at the time, why do you think that was? And is that something that might come back in the here and now? Not saying it should, but does the entire policy of nuclear non-proliferation risk getting reversed given recent developments in world politics?
Yes, please.
My question is a little bit more specific. Maybe this is easily accessible somewhere, but I'm kind of wondering how Hunter Biden ended up where he ended up on the board of this energy group, and I'm kind of curious about why nobody dissuaded him from doing this. I mean, is this normal? Obviously, putting aside what Trump's children are involved in, is it normal for politicians to have these kind of sketchy positions? And is this just being exploited? Only it's a problem now because it's convenient to exploit this one position. It just seems like someone should have told him maybe it was a bad idea to get involved in the energy sector of a country that's notoriously corrupt.
Thank you. Yes, please.
I just wanted to reiterate something that had been said by one of the speakers early on in terms of why Ukraine. I think people talked about the factors that are combined in this, but also opportunistically, there is a connection, as mentioned, CrowdStrike being involved in this, and that they were involved with the Government Accountability Institute or something like that had written the Clinton Cash book. This is a theory that I've heard that makes a lot of sense to me, so I'm putting out there as possible influence, that the Clinton Cash was so successful in undermining Hillary Clinton's campaign and one of many factors that helped to promote Donald Trump and the success of his election, that CrowdStrike wrote another book that came out last year. I don't remember the title of it, but included in a lot of things about corruption. It talked about, Hunter Biden and raised a lot of questions with enough information that you could connect dots to this new conspiracy theory. Didn't get a lot of traction, but it came to Trump's attention because the alt-right were really pushing it forward, and he was like, here's something to take advantage of, and ran with it from there. Now, I don't know if that's true, but it's a theory that made a lot of sense. So.
Okay, thank you. And I'm just trying to check. We are. Is it 5 o'clock, or we can go?
No, it's not 10 minutes.
Till 5:15. Oh, okay, perfect. Yes, please.
So my question is about something that was said earlier. So you said that Vladimir Putin's kind of rationale for the election interference was kind of to get back at Hillary Clinton, but I think that's kind of an oversimplification of Russia's capabilities in cyber technology and just an oversimplification of kind of Vladimir Putin's short-term game. So I'm wondering what you think the long-term, bigger picture puzzle play is for these kind of cyber operations that Russia is conducting. Not just in the United States, but things that we saw in countries like Montenegro and France and other countries in the European Union.
Okay, thank you. So, who would,
yeah,
like to
maybe
start?
I'll start with Professor Suleiman Khan, Fletcher. And then I'll move on to your question. Yeah, thank you, Suleiman. Two excellent questions on EU-Russian rapprochement. So let me start with a comment, but I'll get back to your question. My expertise is in transatlantic relations, U.S. relations with Germany and with European states. And I've been asking my European colleagues about the consequences of a potential Trump re-election. God forbid, but about potential consequences. And basically, I have the feeling from my European contacts that although it's getting difficult, they're willing to grit their teeth and wait out 4 years of Trump on the hopeful assumption that he was an anomaly, result of the hacking, the peculiarities of the Electoral College, that ultimately reason will triumph. So our European allies appear to be willing to give us 4 years. They are not willing to give us 4 years and a day. So if Trump is reelected, there are profound shifts coming in global order, in transatlantic relations, in EU-US relations. And then, yes, there may be reconsideration of relations with Russia. Already within Germany, there's been a willingness to maintain closer relations with Putin, particularly over Nord Stream, particularly over the pipelines, than there is in the United States, and that may in fact intensify. So I think we're all kind of the world is literally holding its breath for the 2020 election, and if Trump is reelected, then I think we will see some very profound realignments. By the way, not just with Europe. I was actually invited, I was in Washington at dinner with the Canadian ambassador, and I asked him this question. This has gotten to be my standard question when I meet foreign leaders or ambassadors. Will you give us, how much more than 4 years will you give us? And basically, the Canadian ambassador said not 1 minute more if Trump is reelected. Then even we as Canadians are going to reconsider our complete relationship with the United States. On your second question, so would it have made sense since the Americans, the U.S. attitude to Russia publicly at the end of the Cold War to the Soviet Union was, oh, we want to cooperate. Internally, internal documents that kind of gotten declassified, the U.S. attitude was to hell with them. We prevailed. They didn't. They're not in a position to dictate the post-Cold War orders. That's the internal attitude. So on the surface, what you're saying, hey, let's let the Ukrainians keep their weapons and aim them at Moscow would seem to be consistent with that, except for on a very practical level, the situation in Ukraine was so chaotic. These are strategic nuclear weapons pre-programmed with U.S. cities, right? If a mouse runs across them at the wrong time, they are going to destroy Boston, okay? The situation is so immediately critical, and things in Ukraine are so chaotic, it just, in the short run, makes no sense. If Ukraine were a well-functioning, well-organized state from the get-go, and it could easily have stepped into the role of an ally, then maybe it would have made sense to say, yes, let's let Ukraine keep those weapons. But what there really was just all-out panic at the highest level of the administration, is that no one had any idea who had launch command over these weapons, or just even below that, who had the key to the door you needed to get into the silo. Like, it was so dangerous, and these things were, to repeat, pre-programmed with U.S. cities and targets, that you just needed immediately to do whatever you could to decrease that threat, right? And that was, get the things dismantled, detargeted, whatever. So there wasn't enough time for the long-term strategic gamesmanship. That does come back later, right? Like later, then suddenly people started thinking, hey, maybe that wasn't such a great idea, giving up those weapons. But in the panic of the time, it just wasn't a realistic option. And then in response to your question, so as a historian, the only phenomenon I have never observed is monocausality. So I would push back against your notion that my talking about Putin's dislike of Hillary Clinton is an oversimplification. I'm not trying to simplify it, I only had 10 minutes. That's part of the mix. There are multiple reasons for Putin doing what he's doing. And certainly the factors that you mentioned, the capabilities that are present, his desire to use some other places, that's all part of the mix too. I'm just saying that from what I know of Putin, and Putin's background is one that I recognize because he spent a great deal of time in the place I know well and have lived, which is former East Germany. I recognize that event in his life as a formative event. He was on the ground in East Germany when East Germany collapsed. He was a KGB agent there. It was a searing event for him. He has never forgotten it. And when the 25th anniversary of that event rolled around, I had this feeling he was going to do something to mark it. I mistakenly thought perhaps it would be an incursion in the Baltics or something like that, but I belatedly found out he spent the 25th anniversary engaging in hacking of the U.S. election. So I think that was definitely part of the mix, but I didn't in any way mean to represent here to say it was the only thing. Of course, there's a bunch of other factors that go into that.
Maybe I could address briefly the question of why would Hunter Biden want to be in the board of Burisma. Unfortunately, it's not unusual at all for companies to try to increase their respectability or their influence by having important former politicians or relatives of politicians on their board. If we look at Gazprom, we have the former German chancellor there. And why would he want to do it? I think greed, maybe college tuition for his kids.
That's for a hell of a lot of college.
Well, one semester per month. Why nobody advised him better? That's an interesting question. Yes, but it's not unusual, unfortunately.
Yeah, just on that point, a week ago there was an article in the New York Times about this that you should take a look at, Isabel, if you're interested in. Okay. It's not unusual at all, unfortunately. Very quickly, so the point about EU rapprochement with Russia, I think increasingly we can't talk about the EU as a cohesive entity, and that's really important.
Yeah, exactly.
For me, what this points out is the brittleness of the EU. Now you have Germany that has, for instance, business interests that are understandable, even though Germany is having its own challenges to liberal democracy with the rise of the AfD and so forth. But the real challenge is happening in the former Warsaw Pact states. It's happening in East Central Europe. We talk about democracy, we talk about kind of Western models. We often forget democracy is prefaced usually with an adjective, liberal democracy. They're not having trouble with democracy, they're having trouble with the liberal part of this equation. So countries like Hungary, they have business interests as well, but they're also ideological interests here, that making common cause with Putin plays well for a domestic audience in some respects. So I would just push back on that. I think we shouldn't talk about EU policy as a unitary policy. We should also think very seriously about domestic incentives for each of the EU states, both major and minor, to cooperate or not cooperate with Russia on various policy issues. On the wider question of why is Putin doing this, I think everyone is talking about this like this is an outcome that he wants to achieve. I'm viewing this more as an experiment on what is possible. I think there's a lot to be said for sowing FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? And they've done this very successfully. It's no longer necessary to prove something is true. It's just necessary to sow reasonable doubt. And this is proving, it's proven very effective so far, but think about how much more effective it could prove. I mean, if Putin decides to stay on beyond his term, if Putin does decide to encroach either into the Baltic states or further into Ukraine, I'm not saying that any of this is necessarily going to happen or even possible, but I think there's a longer-term vision, maybe not being pursued by Putin, but certainly I think by his military command structure. I think they're thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead. The U.S. for a long time has played checkers when it came to that region of the world. Russia for a long time has been playing chess.
Actually, just to jump in there, you don't necessarily have to have an end state. Putin obviously does not want either Georgia or Ukraine to ever be in NATO, but he doesn't have to conquer all of Georgia or conquer all of Ukraine to achieve that goal. It's a condition of NATO membership that you not be in conflict with any of your neighbors over your borders. So all he has to do is keep the conflict in South Ossetia and the Donbass going, and that's the end of Georgian and Ukrainian NATO membership, right? So it's I think the key phrase with Putin is always hybrid, right? This is sort of a hybrid solution. It may not have an end state, but it's good enough to stop NATO from going to Georgia and Ukraine, and who knows where I like the FUD, that's good. And it generates FUD, and it keeps things problematic for the West. You don't necessarily have to have a master plan, you just do enough to halt the outcomes you don't want. The other thing about Putin that's interesting is for so long during the post-Cold War era, which by the way I think ended in 2014, so for me as a historian, it's useful when an era ends, because as a historian, you can then talk about it from beginning to end. So it's bad for world peace, but good for my next book contract, so net win. The post-Cold War era ended in basically in 2014, largely because of what Putin was doing. So I think that was also an important breaking point, that he showed that this post-Cold War order is now over, right? We're going to change borders by force. And what that revealed to me is that Putin realized what a lot of us have forgotten, which is that you can sometimes solve crises through escalation, right? In the post-Cold War era, we've gotten focused on not using force, not using violence, trying to de-escalate conflicts as a goal. Putin has realized if at key moments you escalate, you go into Syria, you send in some troops, you can solve a crisis that way. Right? Georgia and Ukraine are not going into NATO, so that crisis is over as a result of that escalation. And it was just enough escalation to solve that particular problem, and now we can move on. I think Putin has played a very weak hand very well, and he's done it through these kind of tactics that you've identified.
I think one just important follow-on on that is that we often think about these sort of frozen conflicts as a transitional state, as something that will be resolved. But as the case of Transnistria proves, they can persist for a very long period of time. This could be actually a very stable, in some ways, situation.
Intentionally so.
Intentionally so, absolutely.
Should be the topic of our next one.
Let me just advocate really quickly for an excellent article by 2 anthropologists, Elizabeth Dunn and Michael Bobek, that's called The Empire Strikes Back, War Without War and Occupation Without Occupation, which lays out this as an intentional strategy with the goal that destabilization is actually more important than any kind of territorial conquest. It doesn't matter if Putin actually takes control of the Donbass. It's actually better for him if he doesn't, because then Russia and Putin don't take on any of the possible economic difficulties. They don't have to commit to rebuilding, what has been destroyed in this war, but they get the instability that benefits only Putin.
Thank you. I believe we have still time for one last round, and the absolutely last question.
Yes, thank you. I just have a question about the Quid and the Steinmeier formula, and really Ukraine's ability to kind of solve the crisis, or at least Zelensky's decision space. So in terms of the Quid, the arms package, do you think the bipartisan consensus, for what it's worth, on Ukraine is going to survive this crisis, this scandal? And second, how does the double policy, as you put it, how does that affect President Zelensky's decision space? Do you think he's adopting Steinmeier or accepting Steinmeier, or at least advocating that he's going to accept it? Is that just trying to buy time for this scandal to play out and give him some space, or does he have kind of a longer term plan to solve the crisis and fulfill his campaign promises?
So maybe I can take a shot at the second part of the question. Sorry.
Let me see. Maybe there are no other. I don't see any hands raised. So I'll ask maybe the last question, and then we'll go to. And the question that I'm going to ask, I know that you will hate it. It will be about the future and prediction of the future, and that's what audiences come for. So we don't know how the impeachment inquiry will end, but it looks like this is something that will last for a relatively long period of time. And we have this major scandal, whatever the term we use to name it, American or Ukrainian or American-Ukrainian scandal. And my question is about its impact in the future on the either U.S. policy or internal, external, or on the situation in Ukraine. Whether you think it will have long-term impact, and if it will, what kind of impact that might be. So again, I probably would appreciate if you would start with Adam's question, and then eventually, if you know what will happen in the future, comment on mine as well.
So a couple of words. President Zelensky is in a tremendously difficult situation right now. Anything he does can spell disaster for his own political future, but for Ukraine as well. And I'm not a fan of him to start with, but this is a very difficult situation to be in. The Steinmeier approach, accepting or reintegrating these two entities into Ukraine under a particular set of commitments, that is very problematic for Ukraine, tremendously problematic for Ukraine. But it may be, as you said, the only way to buy time until another solution may be found. And given the very tenuous situation of the relationship with the U.S., he may be tempted to do that, even when in Ukraine there is tremendous opposition to that. And I think some of the other people in the panel will be addressing that. What is this going to do in the future? I'm afraid this is going to end up hurting Ukraine more than anybody else. Because again, we are going to blame Ukraine for the crisis. When the M17 flight was downed on Ukraine with how many hundreds of Dutch citizens, I thought this would increase Dutch sympathy for Ukraine. No, it simply associated Ukraine with a catastrophe that affected them, and it did not improve the situation. So I'm very, very much afraid that this is going to, again, turn us away from Ukraine. And we have to be very careful, those of us who are engaged in a public debate, we need to be very careful to make sure that we don't let that happen.
Yeah, maybe I'll address the Steinmeier question as well. But I think it kind of comes at an interesting time because these things are happening at the same time. So up until this point, Zelensky has worked fairly hard, in my view, to at least try to do the things that he promised that he would do. And then these two things come at a time where he sort of has some momentum, and now he is proposing this extremely unpopular solution for a problem that is, I mean, complex is, it's not even adequate to describe, right? So I think it's a really risky time for him as this person who has all this weight on his shoulders of possibly being a better representative of democracy, because he doesn't theoretically have the same ties to oligarchs and businesses that previous presidents have had, theoretically maybe. It may basically make it impossible for him to really gain the credibility that he was after. That being said, I mean, I think I sort of briefly mentioned this in the talking part, but Poroshenko didn't really move to resolve the conflict, right? He was sort of at an impasse with that, and I think Zelensky was elected in part because of that. People are looking for a resolution, but that resolution has to benefit Ukraine, right? And is Ukraine in a position to actually make the kinds of demands and negotiate for something that benefits Ukraine over everybody else? not really. So what does he do? I mean, maybe you're right about buying time, but also maybe he just wants to find a solution and then be able to claim I found the solution. Whatever anybody else thinks, you know, I don't really care. He has also promised to be a one-term president, so I think that might affect his willingness to entertain risky solutions, right? Because he's not going to be campaigning for re-election, theoretically. But that also, you know, bodes poorly for the future of Ukraine. If this all is the beginning of a kind of downward spiral in which paying attention to Ukraine means kind of blaming everything on Ukraine, that's not great. I've previously been pretty optimistic, but this is not great all at once. So I'm not sure.
So in terms of predictions, I have a very strict policy of not making predictions until after I'm pretty sure I'll be dead, so then I can't be proved wrong. At least I won't know about it. But in the shorter term, you know, you asked about internal, what this meant internally for the United States, and maybe I'll take a stab at that, even though I've already established I'm not a Americanist. I think this is, you know, President Trump just recently tweeted that if the impeachment proceeds, that this will have Civil War-like implications. I mean, this is an actual tweet, you could look it up. I'm afraid that he's, in some respects, right. I mean, I think the fractures I see in America right now are certainly more profound than I've ever seen in, you know, my 4 decades. And I think these will have very long-lasting implications, particularly if President Trump is elected or impeached, either way, actually, to elected to a second term or removed from office. On what this will mean for Ukraine, I agree with what's been voiced so far, with what Margarita said, what was said, that, you know, this is so much a proxy conflict in so many ways, or at least it's being presented as a proxy conflict between the US and Russia. And we're forgetting, again, Ukraine. And we've forgotten Ukraine so many times in the past. And I'm just afraid that that's going to happen again. So I don't offer you any predictions. I offer you a bit of pessimistic rumination. I'm sorry. I would like to offer you some hope and optimism, but I'm at a point where I'm stuck on pessimism at this moment. You know, but the wider controversy also points up Michel's iron law of oligarchy. You know, this was a theory that was current more than 100 years ago, but it's one that's coming back into vogue. Anders Ostlund has talked about the Ukrainian state as a state that's seized by big business interests. I think that's quite true. Arguably, we can make the same comment about America in recent decades. So it's not just about state-to-state relations. It's not just about foreign policy. It's also about following the hryvnia or the dollars or the rubles. And I think, you know, this is kind of the argument I've heard you make before in following these value chains as well. So I think we have to analyze this at many different levels.
Yeah, so on the 2 questions, what does it mean for Ukraine and what will happen? So on what will it mean for Ukraine, obviously I don't know, but I think that so far Zelensky and his foreign minister are not handling this in an optimal fashion, which would be to say as little as possible. I don't know how many of you heard this morning BBC NewsHour. There was, I thought, a spectacularly ill-advised interview with the Ukrainian foreign minister, where my jaw basically dropped, where he basically said this phone call didn't happen. Nothing to see her, folks. Move along. It was a very, very strange interview, and it seemed, it was sort of so unbelievable that it just immediately made you, as a listener, wonder for what reason is the Ukrainian foreign minister coming to Trump's rescue in such an egregious fashion. I mean, you know, I can understand why Zelensky might not have wanted this transcript released, but it's out now. And I think the least said, the better on the part of Ukraine. This is, you know, going to be a maelstrom inside the United States. For what reason would you want to wade into that? So I think the initial behavior of Zelensky, who gave that bizarre extended press conference in a food court, and now his foreign minister, who gave this really bizarre extended interview, that is a self-harming approach. And if anyone there were calling to ask me, I would say this is, as Jacques Chirac used to say, this is an opportunity to be quiet. So that would be my advice to the Ukrainian government. On the prediction of what will happen, I actually think it is possible to predict 2 out of 3 developments. Trump will be impeached. He will not be removed from office. What is unclear is whether he will remain the Republican nominee. So the House impeachment inquiry will proceed. The House will impeach him. It will then go to the Senate. The Senate will either ignore it or not remove him. Whatever exactly Mitch McConnell does as a mechanism, I don't know, but it won't result in approval. The question is what will happen to his ratings in the course of that process. And that will depend on what comes out. And if Republicans start to see it as not in their self-interest to hold on to him as the nominee, then it could get very interesting. So that, I think, is the big question.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for your answers. And we have here one little anecdote to end up on a more positive note.
We hope.
No, I'm not saying it's a more positive note.
Oh, then?
You may not want to hear it. I just returned from Ukraine about 2 weeks ago. This whole story, the whole issue that we've been discussing today, or the prelude for this meeting today, happened while I was in Kiev. But I just, as an anecdote to add our conversation, first on, I think it was Friday, the 7th, before I flew to Amsterdam, I saw an article in Kiev Post. There's just the English language paper that was being distributed in the hotel where I was staying, close to my academic host. That was, I hope some of you have seen it, on the re-oligarchization of Ukraine. And later, toward the end of this paper, when I was looking at things going on in Kiev, it was speaking about a museum of corruption. I was very intrigued, and my last day in Kiev, before my flight back to Amsterdam, I spent at the estate of Yanukovych, How many of you have seen this? Have any of you seen this? I recommend all of you, anyone who goes to Ukraine, to take the time to see this. I was taken through by my host, who was an archivist who happened to be one of the ones that was brought in 2014, to try to save the papers of the account books that we're all talking about, that were waterlogged. And he had, because they'd had some experience in archival and technical archival rescues, he was able to do so. And he took me, he hadn't seen the museum since 2014 himself. And he was absolutely amazed when we took a little cart around the museum, around this great estate. I don't think there is anything more that could speak of Ukraine, and it was very sad to me. But what was saddest to him was that I think there must have been 20 or 30 wedding parties that were celebrating their wedding in this museum of corruption. And that somehow is a very sad comment on the political or on the social culture of Ukraine. And I think that is what hurt this colleague, who spent a lot of time here at Harvard too, and who, because it's a very sad picture, Ukraine. I came to Ukraine from Moscow. I couldn't fly direct. I couldn't take a direct train overnight that I used to do before 2014. I had to go to Riga, which was the shortest time and the cheapest flight from Moscow to Kiev. But they left my walker at the airport in Riga. That's not the point. But the point is that the break between Moscow and Kiev, and now why Ukraine, but why this massive museum of corruption? And why, if this means reallocation of society in Ukraine, this is what I found the saddest point of this trip. Even if Zelensky had also abolished the Ministry of Culture, and apparently the new ministry will now be Media, Culture, and Sport.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, of course, I was struggling with the way how to put a positive spin on all of that.
Yes,
and
well, I didn't
my only solution is that now we have a museum of corruption. We know where to send corruption. On that semi